to the show. I'm Antisocial. And this is the Antisocial Network.
I want to talk to her, but my face is up against the wall. Yeah, I think she wants to talk to me, but I'm antisociable. Yeah. Antisociable.
This week, I dive into the history of tipping in America, how it's rooted in racism, and how we still rely on it today to exploit marginalized workers. Thanks for tuning in! Are you a good tipper? Are there certain places or services you don't tip or where you always tip? Why and how do you decide that? Is it really based on service, or is it based more on how much money you have at the time and the overall cost of what you're spending? How did this even become a thing? If you're not from America, or if you've ever traveled outside the United States, you know that tipping is a uniquely American thing. Sure, people tip all over the world, but it's not expected and ingrained in society nearly as much anywhere else than in America. Why is that? While we may like to think of tipping as uniquely American, it wasn't always that way. We didn't invent it. In fact, tipping started in Europe, and when people started to do it here, there was a lot of opposition. Many people found tipping to be futile, creating a class system which they felt was inherently anti-American and went against this country's founding principles. Conversely, many immigrants to America were accustomed to tipping, and often both servants and the served expected to either tip or be tipped. Still, there was much pushback in the early days of America's history, as opponents claimed that an economy which relies upon tipping creates a serfdom, or a class of flunkies, as was often argued, and America was not founded on such ideals. Unsurprisingly, America's sordid past with tipping is complicated. Following the Civil War, one of the first entrepreneurs to really exploit the idea of tipping was a man named George M. Pullman. Pullman began hiring thousands of Southern black men after the emancipation of enslaved people in America. He had started a luxury railroad line in which delusional white passengers could pay to basically have a servant for the length of their vacation. In other words, Southerners who could not afford to have a servant in their home could tip Pullman porters to do a myriad of tasks, from shining their shoes to entertaining their children, and live out their fantasies of being slave owners. Pullman exclusively hired black men from the South because, in his estimation, the plantation had trained them to be pleasing to guests. Black men who worked on these sleeping cars as porters earned about $27 a month from Pullman, not close to a livable wage, but their income would be supplemented by the passengers who would tip porters in exchange for them to be waited on. This model would largely be adopted by many industries who still exploit their workers by relying on consumers to make up the difference in tips, largely the service industry, restaurant workers, and bartenders. If American tipping really is a holdover from European notions of feudalism, then why isn't tipping so ingrained in the UK? And why is it basically mandatory here? Well, there's a very specific answer for that. Despite the fact that tipping was hotly debated from the start in America, that began to change around the 1920s. Why? Because of Prohibition, of course. Bars and restaurants lost such a huge source of revenue once alcohol was criminalized that whether servers should be paid more wasn't even a question. Even after Prohibition ended, this had pretty much solidified tipping culture in America, at least in the service industry. When FDR introduced the country's first minimum wage, ushered in by the New Deal in 1933, restaurant workers were not included in that legislation. That's right, that was the point that really cemented tipping into our nation's history, when the first federal minimum wage ever drafted deliberately omitted the service industry, putting the onus on the American people to pick up the slack of paying servers a livable wage. To be perfectly clear, I want to explain this for people like me who didn't understand this until recently. In California, where I grew up and have lived my whole life, wait staff get paid the state minimum wage plus tips, period. I had no idea it was legal anywhere else in the United States to not do this. But apparently, in most states, it's not only legal but common practice to pay waitstaff significantly less than minimum wage, with the assumption being that tips would make up the rest of their salary. This is fucking criminal. And I'm sorry if you live in a state where this is and has always been common knowledge for you, but it was not until I was well into adulthood that I learned this fact, and I'm still horrified. Whenever I've used the expression, they live off tips, I have never meant it nor understood it in such a literal sense. So, when FDR left the entirety of the service industry out of the minimum wage legislation of the New Deal, he sealed their fate. It was that decision in 1933 that remains the reason and justification why the restaurant industry still operates this way to this day. For those who are familiar with this pay model, eventually the United States Congress proposes what is known as a tip credit in 1966. This is what enables restaurant owners and employers to pay tipped employees what we call a sub-minimum wage. Before that, it was legal to pay servers nothing and expect them to subsist on tips alone. A sub-minimum wage is significantly lower than federal minimum wage and is the required wage that employers must pay tipped staff. And in 1996, Congress voted to stop any future increases on that number and freeze it at $2.13 nationwide. While the rest of the country is fighting for a lousy $15 minimum wage, which is arguably still low, service industry workers who rely on tips have been stagnant at $2.13 since 1996. For reference, the last time the federal minimum wage was raised was 2009. What about Europe? Well, instead of writing financial dysfunction into law like the US did, Europe decided to integrate a service fee into their economy, thus eliminating the master-serf relationship inherent in the classism of mandatory tipping. That service fee is then split evenly between all staff, elevating all employee earnings while simultaneously removing any awkward decision-making for the customer. Of course, tipping is not outlawed, it merely changes the dynamic so that tipping in Europe is truly based on rewarding good service, because Europeans don't need to worry as much about supplementing their waiter or waitress's salary. Despite my own ignorance about it because I'm a Californian, in the majority of the United States where it is common practice for employers to pay their waitstaff a diminished wage in exchange for expected tips, consumers have an understanding that tips are less based on good service and more a necessary tax on dining. We only tell ourselves that tipping is at our discretion, but we know socially that we'd better tip, if even only for the reason of not looking like an asshole. Alternatively, when we are the ones working for tips, we tell ourselves that of course tipping is based on good service. Sure, some people are just stingy or racist or whatever, and they're not going to tip regardless. But most of the time, demeanor and rapport factor into a customer's decision to tip. Or how much, right? Well, data shows that's less true than we like to believe. People's tendency to tip and how much they tip seems to have much more to do with how much money they have spent, societal pressures, and ego. Being nice and personable have way less to do with tips than we like to think. And that's because, well, look at it this way. If tips are service-oriented, then any tip I get, I earned by providing good service. Otherwise, it's just a handout, and that's less socially acceptable. Basically, we all believe this visage that tipping is consensual and voluntary, when we all know as customers that we have to do it, and as employees that we need them to pay our rent, whether we served well or not. That's why even if we think we tip well, always tip 25%, or can only afford to tip 15%, there will always be a server who thinks you're cheap for tipping the minimum or tipping the average. They're right that they're owed more, and this shitty system is rigged against the worker. It should be the employer paying more, not a standoff between customer and employee over a fight that's not theirs to have in the first place. Before I continue, I need a snack. Let's jump to break. Ladies, aren't we always hearing about men and their needs? How they always need time to escape and unwind in their man caves. What about us? Well, with Man-Slave, you can get more done than you ever thought possible. While your man relaxes and disassociates in his man cave, your man-slave can cook, clean, and service more than your Lexus, if you know what I mean. Ladies, invest in yourself this season and order your very own Man-Slave today. Note, Man-Slaves only come in Caucasian, off-white, and eggshell. Attention, leftist lovers! If you're single and ready to mingle, but none of the current dating apps appeal to your revolutionary sensibilities, then Mittens is the perfect app for you. Created by bummed Bernie bros out of work and without a cause, this dating app is unparalleled and teeming with wokeness. Matching you with other environmentally conscious, forward-thinking, and like-minded comrades, Mittens will make your sustainably sourced vegan heart pitter-patter. At Mittens, we are inclusive and intersectional, prioritizing BIPOC profiles, women, and the gender nonconforming. And Mittens only invites bisexual, queer, gender fluid, trans, and non-binary men to join. Photos depicting mission trips, white saviorism, big cat petting, and brunch are strictly prohibited. Download Mittens and upload your voting history today to get started. We're back. It's no surprise that the restaurant industry is vehemently against the proposed $15 minimum wage increase. They have subsisted on the backs of their exploited workers for decades, justified by legislation that cements tipping as a dependable way for employers to cut costs and supplement their workers' income by relying on customers to do it for them. Now business owners want to cry about how unfair it is that anyone even suggests they pay workers a minimum wage. There are a few hundred restaurants nationwide that have banned tipping, with some studies showing that restaurants like these that have eliminated tipping have universally taken a hit with online reviews. With the one exception of very high-end, expensive restaurants being the outlier, where customers generally have the money to spend anyway, most restaurants see a decline in customer satisfaction when they eliminate tipping. That's because the difference is usually made up in higher menu prices. While it would seem that logically consumers would be able to make the connection that a restaurant where you used to tip that had lower prices, and now you pay slightly increased prices but don't have to tip, is essentially evening out, studies show consumers don't see it that way. Turns out they only really factor in the price on the menu when choosing a dining location, and not whether they will be expected to tip or not. To me, this doesn't make sense and seems like skewed data, and it came from some junk podcast, and so I'm not even going to cite it. But I reference it because these are the types of arguments restaurant and small business owners make all the time in opposition to raising a minimum wage or eliminating a tipping system. They claim that their business will suffer if they're forced to increase their payroll. What's funny is that this tipping model is so ingrained in the service industry and American business at this point that employers don't even see a problem with saying that. They feel entitled to a workforce they barely have to pay and then point to the way the system was set up and say, "It's not my fault I'm going out of business if I have to pay my employees. This is the way it's always been. If we got rid of tipping, I'd have to supplement that loss of income somehow, and consumers just aren't ready to accept that increase. They'll go somewhere else for a burger that hasn't increased their prices." But that's an absurd argument because this is a government-backed and enforced problem. I'm not sure anyone is suggesting we eliminate tipping by a single company bravely going against the grain, one boycott at a time. Because yeah, that would force lots of places out of business. And the whole argument that consumers are not prepared to pay increased menu prices is twofold. One, we're already not prepared to supplement service workers' incomes by paying an additional fee every time we dine out, but we've been fucking doing it for decades and pretending it's optional. And two, yeah, consumers aren't ready to pay increased menu prices because our cost of living has been going up exponentially for decades, while our incomes have remained the same. Just like the working class servers who live off of tips, many of us who dine out are subsisting on low wages or part-time work too. When restaurant owners complain that they can't pay employees more because it will result in higher menu prices that consumers can't afford to pay, we're complaining about the same things. That people don't make enough money to live. It's like saying, I can't pay my employees enough money to live because the other people who buy our product also don't make enough money to live. Again, this is just infighting among the powerless when we should be starting a fucking class war. Lobbying our government to stop military spending and pay its people. I don't know, something. Like, as a leftist, fuck landlords, fuck employers, fuck the ruling class elite. That's my mantra. But for restaurant owners and an entire service industry that has existed off of exploiting workers for over 100 years through the tipping model, to be able to undo this themselves is a little short-sighted. It's a reasonable argument coming from business owners to expect the government to provide a solution when the government is who helped them get into this mess. Had the government never legalized sub-minimum wage pay for service workers, thus forcing an entire industry to depend on consumers to subsidize an entire workforce's wages, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Famously, Leon Trotsky was ardently against tipping. While today many consider generous tipping in America a sign of solidarity with the working class struggle, the notorious Marxist refused to do it, stating that he felt it let capitalists off the hook. There were also many well-known Americans throughout our history that were very against the practice. Howard Taft, Rockefeller, Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and Babe Ruth were all vocally anti-tipping. Before it became so woven into American normalcy, tipping was not only regarded as an archaic custom of the old world bound by a caste system which America was not, but many Americans found it burdensome and resented being shaken down for money everywhere they went, with workers who refused to perform duties unless they were paid. It's also important to note that industries that rely on tips are typically staffed by women and people of color. In the early days of tipping, pioneered by railroad businessman George Pullman in a post-slavery United States, tipping was solidified as a business model in which entrepreneurs could exploit a demographic they felt were used to accepting less. Today, a majority of service industry workers are women and people of color, from waitresses to masseuses to hospital staff. It's not coincidental that race, gender, and class play a role in the tipping debate, with the service industry being made up of mostly marginalized people. While there are great reasons to abolish tipping, like simply paying workers a living wage and eliminating the master-serf relationship, we as consumers cannot make an impact as individuals. You can't say, "I'm against tipping," like Trotsky did, and simply opt out of it on principle. While it does let the capitalists off when we supplement our servers' income via tips, as Trotsky put it, it also screws over the worker not to tip at all in an act of self-righteous protest. If you want to effectively abstain from tipping, you have to abstain from utilizing any services where tipping is normalized. Stop dining out. Don't take Uber. Never get your hair cut. Don't stay in a hotel. I live in a capitalist society where I'm forced to make decisions every day that, quote, let the capitalists off. For instance, when I have to pay higher taxes than corporations and millionaires. There are few things in my control when I am limited by the confines of capitalism. So if I can make the choice that looks like solidarity with the working class, / doesn't make me look like an asshole, / doesn't get my food spit in or whatever, then yeah, I'm going to pay that 20% fee. It's very complicated because we're sort of stuck in this tipping model until the government does something about it. They need to eliminate this sub-minimum wage bullshit and mandate that every employee in every state earn at least the federal minimum wage, regardless of tips or not. This takes the onus off consumers to do what employers should be doing already, paying a living wage. And if this is done unilaterally, then individual businesses will not be adversely disadvantaged, as the entire industry would be affected across the board. This would eliminate the argument that if one restaurant were to ban tipping and raise menu prices, customers would leave and go to other restaurants, because it would be a country and industry-wide overhaul. Consumers would quickly adjust their spending habits to reflect this and simply start tipping less. It doesn't seem that hard to me, but I guess lobbyists and corporate interests and money on paper ledgers and in bank accounts is just more important than the very basic concept that people matter and they deserve to be paid for their work. Some servers argue that they don't want to eliminate tipping because, well, some servers do really well, and when accounting for tips, they may earn significantly more than minimum wage. But that is often servers in highly trafficked areas or at more expensive restaurants and doesn't speak to the majority of an industry that struggles to make their rent in tips each month. Eliminating the practice of letting business owners off the hook by relying on tips to supplement their payrolls wouldn't have to mean the end of tipping entirely. Wouldn't it be nice to be a really great server who got excellent tips but also relied on $15 an hour guaranteed? Ending our tipping system would not abolish tipping, and in a society where it's so ingrained in our culture anyway, good servers would likely still get plenty of tips. Providing a minimum wage to service workers just stops the exploitative practice of giving business owners a financial break for screwing their waitstaff or service workers out of money they're owed anyway. It's really a win-win for everyone. Unless you're some sinister, snidely whiplash type whose success is dependent on taking advantage of people. In which case, fuck you, I hope your restaurant closes. That's my show for this week. I'm Antisocial, and this is the Antisocial Network. If you want even more access to me, Antisocial, follow me on Instagram at the Antisocial Network. To support my content creation dreams and to receive 2 bonus episodes a month, subscribe to my Patreon for only $5 at patreon.com/the Antisocial Network. And, for a limited time, new patrons will receive Antisocial Network stickers and a top-secret handmade zine made by me, Antisocial. To send me voice memos or to submit your own funny fake ad that I might use in my podcast, download the Anchor app and find my show there. As always, new episodes are available in the free feed every week. See you next Wednesday. Later!
But I'm antisociable, yeah.